My name is Candy Borona. I'm happy to facilitate this session on a very important issue. I work around landscape restoration as well as cultural heritage, and I structure a lot of my work around the three-legged African stool, which is what I have here. I'll pass it around. In one of her works, Wangari Maathai writes about rechiseling the three-legged African stool, which is a common feature in many African societies and is chiseled out of a single block of wood. And she calls to Africans and other parties to work towards rechiseling or rebuilding the three-legged African stool. And I think what we are doing here is, in my mind, part of that process of mobilizing efforts towards rechiseling or rebuilding the three-legged African stool. So I'll pass it around for people to have a look at it. So in this session, we'll have 3 presentations, which to me align with the 3 legs of the three-legged African stool, which is moving around there. We will have a presentation from Uganda, which will be showcasing or discussing about the establishment of plantations in landscape restoration, and they will tell us how they are doing that. And we'll have another presentation from Madagascar, which will then focus on community engagement, as well as the use of seed money and investment into growing something bigger. And the third presentation will be from the Trillion Tree Program. Again, here having a different approach of having different stakeholders, or bringing different stakeholders together, as well as the issue of financing. So we are using different entry points to discuss on how to upscale forest restoration around the African continent. But before we move to the case studies, we are very happy to have our keynote speaker here who spoke to us earlier during the plenary session. And I'm happy to invite Stefan Schmitz, who is from the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, also known as the BMZ, or BMZ. Stefan Schmitz, please.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I think we passed now, it's almost 6 o'clock. I think it's not the time for long keynotes, so I will keep it as short as possible. Deforestation and forest degradation are some of the most pressing issues of our time. We are a community of experts. We all know that. I have to say this to you. In Africa, more than 14.2 million hectares of forests were lost in just 5 years between 2010 and 2015, an area bigger than Malawi. Forest cover is still decreasing. Overall, more than 129 million hectares of forests have been lost over the last 25 years worldwide. This is 3.1% of the global forest area, an area as big as South Africa. One of the major reasons for the continuing forest loss is competition for land and resources. Forests are converted into agricultural production area and suffer from unsustainable and illegal practices. Forest degradation leads to further degradation of natural resources, in particular soil and water. This has dramatic consequences for the livelihoods of millions of people who depend on forests and trees for food, energy, income, and other services. According to figures of the International Energy Agency released in 2014, about 80% of people in sub-Saharan Africa depend on firewood for cooking. 80% of the overall population. Restoring forest landscapes is therefore not only a matter of environment and climate protection, it is also a key strategy for sustainable development. Trees and forests provide jobs and economic opportunities. According to figures from the World Bank, the formal timber sector employs more than 13.2 million people worldwide and generates over $600 billion each year. The wood fuel industry creates jobs for tens of millions of households in the form of small-scale wood collection, charcoal production, transportation, and retail. The sub-Saharan Africa charcoal sector alone employs an estimated 7 million people. As a majority of employment in the forest sector remains informal, its true value is hard to estimate, but experts guess that the number of forest-related full-time jobs could quadruple. German Development Cooperation has for a long time been one of the key supporters of international forestry cooperation. In our forestry projects, we try to strike a balance between the conservation of forests and the sustainable management and use of forestry resources, as we believe that the multifunctionality of forests is key for sustainable development. A forest is more than the sum of its trees. The same is true for our international forest engagement. We look at forests in their entirety, taking into account their value for the global climate, the conservation of biodiversity, their role as provider of income, source of energy and livelihoods, and their potential to contribute to sustainable development. Forests are indeed closely linked to the landscapes surrounding them, and I want to share two examples with you. The first example is from Madagascar. Reforestation measures and the efficient use of wood for energy are helping Madagascar to sustainably meet demand in the sector. In a pilot project, 300 smallholder farmers planted forests for use and renewable energy resources on 10,000 hectares of degraded land. They were granted the right to use the products of the afforested areas and receive support in sustainable forest management and in bringing sustainable charcoal to market. The project also supported village charcoal markets that are primarily run by women and so contributed to meeting the energy needs of 10,000 households, mostly in urban areas. The second example comes from Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, the German Development Cooperation is working with the Ministry of Agriculture to bring forest areas under community management. This is crucial to maintain water ability and soil fertility and provide economic opportunities for local people. So far, 24 community-based organizations have been established in the regions of Oromia, Amhara, and Tigray, amounting to a total membership of almost 4,500 people. Communities in the 3 project regions have so far designated 52,000 hectares of forested land for the introduction of participatory management. The communities have received training in running tree nurseries and have already planted approximately 4,000 seedlings. These two examples, these projects, showcase how the conservation and management of forests are connected to the land, the people, and the overall framework conditions. The concept of forest landscape restoration captures all these aspects, and this is why we support the global restoration agenda, in particular the AFR 100 initiative, of which BMZ is a founding partner. These two projects, these two examples are more or less pilot projects. They demonstrate how things could work, and they analyze what works, what doesn't. So we know the way we should take and we could take. Now, it's about scaling up, making it, bringing it, scaling it up, and bringing it broader. This is all about what is needed in the AFR 100 initiative. It's about now scaling. As I mentioned before in the plenary, in most cases we know what to do. The technical sphere is clear. Now we have to lift it up to a political level, to make it scalable, and really to convince political decision makers and local communities that it really counts, that it makes a difference, that it is in their own interests to invest in restoration. We believe that the AFR 100 initiative is a powerful tool to bring together stakeholders, gather political support in countries, and exchange ideas and best practices on how to bring restoration to scale. In the next years, we will continue to support the efforts of African partners to meet their restoration targets. We will not do this alone, but together with international, financial, and technical partners, all of whom bring experience to the table that is needed to produce sustainable results to conserve, manage, and restore African forests. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for that presentation and for the work that you're doing. I will ask you one question, and then I'll invite the audience to ask just one question before we proceed to the next set of presentations. And my question is around the thinking or development of bankable projects. Is your ministry thinking around this area or supporting projects around development of bankable projects?
Yes, we definitely see this as a missing link. In the end, we need the private sector here. And so when we want to bring in private sector, we are talking about bankable projects. So that is definitely the next step now. Thank you for raising that point. I mentioned the need to scale projects. Scaling now not just means bringing it to a political level, but also open it for private sector investment. But these two spheres are closely linked. The public sector, the political sphere, policies need to provide the conducive environment for the private sector. Only then we will be able to generate bankable projects. So that is a missing link. So thanks very much for raising that point.
Thanks very much. Any question from the audience? I'll just take one question, if there is. If not, we can proceed. Oh, right, over there.
Yeah, my name is Rolf Sommer. I work for SIAT here in Nairobi. Sorry. I actually am also quite interested in that, the attracting the private business, and Mr. Schmitz talked about conducive environments. I was wondering, so there's the carrot and there's the stick. If we think about what sticks would we want to use that we haven't used yet to provide more conducive environments? What could that look like?
Yes, you can take it.
Well, I wanted to hand over, to leave that question to the African partners here, because they know far better their environment, and they know far better what is conducive, what are the right carrots and what are the right sticks. Yeah, where are the right where are the bottlenecks? Yeah. Me as a, of course, I can say general remarks on law enforcement, on setting the right legal framework. During the presentation at the plenary, I mentioned 4 ingredients of a good rural governance. That is decentralization, that is empowerment of people and participatory approaches, that is territorial policies and jurisdictional approaches, and finally that is the governance of tenure of land and other productive resources, so this level of individual rights. That is a general notion, and to fill that with policies makes that concrete. I would say that is now in the hand of African societies, African policymakers, and African societies, and say, okay, that kind of decentralization is what we need. And that kind of governance of tenure of land is what is appropriate to our country. And when you answer this question, you are very close, I think, very close to this conducive environment for private investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the upcoming colleagues can also add their voices to that discussion. We'll now move on to the 3 case studies that I spoke about at the beginning, and we'll begin with the case study from Uganda, from the new generation plantations in Africa, creating shared value at landscape scale. And we'll have a presentation from Martin Asimwe, who is from WWF Uganda, and Patrick Mugenyi from New Forest Company, Uganda. And Martin will take the first presentation and will speak about how we can use responsible plantation forestry as an engine for sustainable development at a landscape scale. Martin, please. Yes. You can come.
Thank you, our moderator. Thank you, Stefan, for the good opening. I want to start with a preamble, how WWF comes into this. And WWF 10 years ago started a platform, New Generation Plantations platform, that had recognized the need to engage with private sector to scale up plantations. And now it links so well with forest landscape restoration or forest and landscape restoration. So that is why we're very keen in this presentation. And my topic here, as it reads, is how plantations can be an engine for sustainable development. So this means the presentation at its background has this statement that not every plantation can be an engine for sustainable development, not every forest plantation. So we used the word responsible to cater for the 3 main aspects: that the plantation must be economically viable, that the plantation must be environmentally friendly and socially viable. And socially, it means it is inclusive, the smallholders are benefiting, the medium-level companies and the large-scale companies are all benefiting. So against that background, those three principles of new generation plantations, for most of us here familiar with certification, are similar, except that you are not pursuing a certificate per se. You are doing responsible forestry plantation, but the end is not a certificate per se, but you have that obligation to make sure your plantation practices have minimal or no effect on nature and economic development. So I have 6 take-homes to share with you on how plantation forestry can be sustainable, can support sustainable development. The first one I have there, as you can see, is about where you establish these forest plantations. Based on the experience, it is not sustainable if you plant trees in an area where they do not have a competitive, comparative advantage compared to any other crop. So this means in choosing sites, and that's why it's good we did the ROMs. The ROMs were aimed at ensuring that plantations are only occur in areas that are degraded. Otherwise, it won't be sustainable because of the competing land uses. The food crops will be given probably a priority, and if you plant on lands that are arable for food crops, you stand a chance of losing your plantations. The second one is about the scale. Just the scale has 2 aspects. One is to benefit from economies of scale, largely. That is very, very important. And this can be done at a landscape. So this is addressed to practitioners and donors here, that it is not viable to support a small project here of forest plantations and another there, yet all those scales are minimal. You would rather go to one landscape and do a scale that makes economic sense. The other way is for private sector here to partner with communities as outgrower schemes. I would like to urge all of us from here that in designing next plantation projects, we aim at that the big planters, the big companies that have the capacity to get market should not be stand-alones. And for the donors here, please, you can also emphasize that they should always aim at creating an outgrower scheme. Because based on the experience, the smaller growers, outgrowers, always suffer a number of issues relating to quality, relating to market. And the way out would be partnering with private sector, serious private sector companies. The other thing that makes plantation forestry sustainable or contributes to sustainable development is the where you plant. If it is aimed at reducing degradation of a high conservation value area, for example, an area that is a source of hydropower. Hydropower is, of course, an economic boost, and so if you are restoring a natural forest, planting trees to protect, to reduce pressure on the natural forest that is a catchment, that is also sustainable. That is another aim how we could redirect our resources to plantation forestry. The other aspect is integrating markets from the start. I am sure you are familiar, that's the main challenge. Most of the interventions go full-scale plantations, and they think less about value addition, about creating markets, about job creation for local artisans to convert the products to come. And what we are saying is it is sustainable from this day on, that projects in plantations should have various sectors, should have a component on establishment, a component on value addition, which is an aspect of marketing. And the other one is backing science, best practice, and technology development to improve efficiency. There is a whole chain of science from sourcing the seed to planting, site species matching, and that is also something very important. Otherwise, you could establish an expanse, but if you don't have adequate science and technology, you will not still have any sustainable development that is created. The last one about policy, enabling policy, that was also referred to in the other, by the other speakers. I have highlighted areas where policy can make plantation sustainable. Co-funding or creating funding for private sector, for example, that would be one area. Market creation, ring fencing public procurement to support plantations or to support responsible plantations or certified plantations, that would be another area. Strategy development, and then having district or government business, forest business plans that would help any other player to find a home and to contribute to the development. Those are 6 take-home points. I beg, I urge that you don't forget them if you really want plantations to contribute to sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. We'll now move to the next Ugandan presentation, and please keep your questions to the end. We'll have all the presentations in sequence, and then we'll invite your questions and comments. Let's now have Patrick Mugenyi from New Forests Company, Uganda. Karibu.
Asante. Good evening, everyone. I represent the New Forest Company. I run the Uganda business. For those who are unfamiliar with the work that we do, we have operations in 3 countries, in Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania. And the experience we're going to share with you is coming out of a Uganda operation, which is mirrored in some way in the other 2 countries that we are active in. And so we're addressing how can we partner with communities to create shared value. We talk a lot about sustainability. As private sector actors, this does not happen in isolation. We must find meaningful ways of partnering with the communities that are around our plantations. And at the start of this, we can move on. At the start of this, Kendi spoke about the 3-legged stool. It's very similar to our approach to business. We have a very strong focus on commercial profitability. We're a private business. And we must be able to fulfill the requirements and the targets set by different stakeholders. But we have a commitment to conservation as well. We can't do the commercial side and forget the conservation. So as an example, we have our current footprint in Uganda is 22,000 hectares. We ring fence 40% of that in conservation areas. It's riverine areas, it's areas that are protected, and we don't plant in those areas. So conservation is at the heart of what we do. But the third leg of the stool is what we'll kind of zero in on, which is the community. How do we work with the community in a sustainable way? We started something that we are calling Forests for Prosperity that captures the heart of what we're doing to work with communities to deliver value to them. And on the next slide, we'll easily see the kind of background. I'll not get into all of it, but suffice to say that we approached it as a shared vision, working with the communities to ask what sort of vision do we want to see. At the very start, we're a 10-year-old business. At the start of this process, it was a very antagonistic relationship between us and our communities. But through lengthy consultations, We worked together to identify a vision that we could all buy into and co-design a meaningful intervention that developed into what we're calling Forests for Prosperity. What this is it boiled down to key indicators, which on the next slide you'll be able to see, that we agreed with the communities to say, as long as these indicators are met, the communities have a financial reward because there's a benefit to the company, there's a benefit to the community. In our what we consider our best practice in a plantation called Kirinya in the east of Uganda, we've divided the plantation into 4 sectors. And each community is responsible for a sector of that plantation. And that responsibility means they look out for, if you could move to the next slide. They look out for these indicators, incidents of fire. The community is closest to that fire. Sometimes our watchtowers may not be able to see in the areas where the fires are started. And the communities are quick to report the fires for our fire teams to address them. Incidents of theft and so on, grazing. These are all things that we face as challenges in green fields, forestry in Africa, and have to find meaningful ways of working with the community. The process is transparent, the process is open, all the communities understand what they're being measured against, we agree on a reward system, and at the end of the review period, as long as those indicators are met, the community gets a financial benefit. And that's how we've been able to, over time, align our interests as a private sector player with the communities that we border. Is it working? We've seen that it is working. We've run in our oldest plantation for 3 years now, and the indicators are positive, and we continue to improve this. It's by no means complete, but we do have clear results. Next slide. So incidents have reduced significantly year on year, and largely attributed to community involvement, community participation, where we move from an antagonistic stance to one where there is a benefit for both the private sector actor and the communities that we border. One thing that I would like to highlight is that in addition to the financial reward that the communities get, we've gone further in this last year to partner with a local finance institution that is targeted to circles or community associations. And the idea here is to not only allow the communities to have the benefit of their financial reward, which averages about $1,000 to $1,500, to be able to leverage that for additional funding. That funding comes along with training. The communities have to attend classes to prepare, to understand what it means to take on these facilities and how the payback works, and to develop projects that are bankable or that can be funded even at a community level. So we've seen everything from beekeeping to fish farms and anything that the community wants to get involved in to improve their livelihood around the forests that we've planted. And so far it's been received very, very well. They've been able to leverage up to 4 times what they have. So we're tracking that closely and want to grow that. There are many lessons learned. We've summarized some of them here. And I've spoken a bit about the need for a shared vision, the critical importance of co-designing, which our keynote speaker referred to earlier, more participatory, more partnering with communities. We see the need to develop co-ownership. The idea is that we collaborate with our communities. Nothing works if we don't do that. One of the critical success factors that we see is also the need for just improving the governance around these community associations. As they grow, as they become a bit more profitable, they experience challenges they never had before, and it's important to help them be clear on how to govern their community associations. We don't take responsibility for it, but we help them in preparing for the future. We have outstanding questions, but I'll quickly, in the interest of time, talk about something that's extremely dear to us as private sector players, which is the funding of these greenfields forests in Africa. We took the bold move 10 years ago to start this journey, and it's been a very, very tough journey. But we think we've learned lessons that may be useful to others that are coming up behind us and to those around this room. 3 thoughts I'd like to leave with you, and this came out of a study tour that was run, that we hosted in Uganda with the New Generation Plantation, around what innovative funding models can we look at to encourage more private sector players to enter the agroforestry space in Africa. The first is blended finance. This idea that we need to find a way of working with DFIs, with philanthropic funds, and private investors to take the sting of the risk out of investing in these long-term assets. As it stands now, private investors alone will not be able to give us the kind of scale we're looking for to have the impact that we all seek along those 3-legged stools. The second idea coming out of our study tour was the idea that public and private partnerships are going to be key. Could I dare our government representatives and say, let's consider public funds to support this kind of work? It takes patient capital, it takes long-term capital, and not many actors exist. So beyond policy, beyond an enabling framework, we're going to need to find a mechanism that allows governments to participate economically. Otherwise, left to the private sector alone, we shall not see the scale that we look for. The third innovative idea was around encouraging our governments to spur market creation. And this is something that Martin very clearly laid out for us. This idea that in our procurement systems, can we not work with institutions like FSC to ensure that there is a certain minimum quality that our governments are procuring? Governments are big actors in all of our economies, particularly in our part of the world. And just by setting procurement standards that encourage private sector players to service an existing market, we shall begin to see scale come to play, and there shall not be 3 active participants in Uganda. Maybe next time we meet, we could have even 10. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We'll now move to Madagascar, where our colleagues will share a case study of important lessons learned from 13 years of restoration in a moist tropical forest, the Fandriana Marolambo landscape in Madagascar. And we'll start with Simon, who is a senior officer at Terrestrial Biodiversity, WWF Madagascar. Karibu, Simon.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the experience that we have achieved in Madagascar. Actually, I'm not going to give details because of time. I'm not going to describe the project or describe the activities, but just go straight to the lesson learned. Anyway, I will give you some information about the landscape. Yes, a little bit of information on the landscape. It is located in the central Madagascar, in the humid forest ecoregion of Madagascar. And the surface area is about 200,000 hectares. And there are actually about 150,000 people living in the landscape, and about 2,700 households live directly from the use of forest and natural resources in the site landscape, and also 40 administrative communes, and the growing rate of population is about 3%. From 1999 to 2000, the deforestation rate is about 2.58%, but now, after the program, it is about 1% with the deforestation rate. That is below the average deforestation, the national deforestation rate of Madagascar. And that still, the forest is severely fragmented, and actually forested areas are cleared for agriculture, slash and burn agriculture, and sugarcane plantation. The driver of these activities is mainly the migration. Yes. Few figures on the result achieved from the project. About 6,700 hectares are active and passive restoration, and about 50,000 hectares are now under community-based natural resources management, and 95,000 hectares in new protected areas within the landscape. Lessons learned on the aspect of governance and partnership and mine actors. We found that local governance structure needs to be strengthened. Before, from top, it was top-down. That means the forest service at the center of the process. And now it is bottom-up with the community at the center of the negotiations and decision-making. The second lesson learned on this is the establishment of multi-level partnerships. It is clear that WWF initiated the project, the initiative, but we have integrated a lot of stakeholders and partners into the AVALAR project, actually, such as the local government, forest administration, mayors, and local associations and other NGOs. And we set up 2 working groups. One is at the landscape level, and one is at the national level. On the social aspect and the understanding of ecological and socioeconomic context, we found that success requires a strong social dimension. That is a consideration of socioeconomic context in the landscape. So, for instance, the recognition of local rights and local land tenure, for example. The recognition of traditional social structure and local leadership, yes. For the ground implementation, it is important to have a scientific and traditional knowledge. Of course, we may conducted a lot of studies and surveys during the program. On the process, as Patrick said, it was important to have a shared vision, and we have that experience in Madagascar. And also on the zoning helps actually to design the activities that we are going to implement. It helps also adapting, for instance, agricultural practices for the identification of income generating activities and so on. On the implementation, scale really matters. Of course, many interventions may need to be local, but they should be integrated within the landscape plan or the landscape context. And also, the commitment to the long term is crucial, very important. It should be flexible, and the design of a sustainable action plan is important. Of course, the landscape cannot be considered as restored even after 13 years. Now, WWF has exited from the landscape, but the communities and the other stakeholders continue to work on this. On the monitoring, monitoring is crucial. It's important to identify key indicators. And the monitoring might be limited to punctual sites, but it is important to have a clear view of success. On the aspect of conservation, we think that the restoration activities improve conservation because they restore not only the vegetation, but also the ecological functions and goods and services of ecosystems. So, in summary, we think that it is important to design and implement forest landscape restoration with social strong dimension and strengthen local governance structure. Lastly, Madagascar has now a national FLR strategy, and we know currently the priorities in terms of geography. So these lessons learned will help the government to develop an action plan for the strategy, and we hope that these lessons learned highlighted through this presentation will help to have this action plan. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. I now invite Valerie, who is a geographer specialized in environment and land use planning.
Good afternoon, everybody. So let me introduce myself first. So I am working at the Ministry of Environment on Madagascar. I am the national focal point of a soil project, which aim at rehabilitating soil rehabilitation for food security. I am also a member of FLR National Committee in Madagascar. According to the case of Madagascar, Madagascar has committed to the pledges of FLR regarding forest and land degradation that really harms the country, and regarding also poverty and food insecurity that touched 50% of the population. So Madagascar has set a vision to restore and harmoniously valorized forest and landscape restoration, and had committed to restore 4 million hectares of forest landscape. According to that, from this commitment, Madagascar has progressed by doing opportunity assessment evaluation first, and then setting up the national committee and framing its national strategy on forest and landscape restoration, and also designing the mapping and identifying the prior landscape for FLR. After that, as perspective, Madagascar plans to declinate the national committee at the regional level, and also to set up and to promote the implementation of a landscape management plan for for each landscape, prior landscapes, and before that, setting up of guidelines, first for framing this management plan for prior landscapes. We expect scaling up first through massive mobilization of population, and secondly, for better delimiting according to land tenures, we plan to delimitate the statute of each land, so that we can set clear how to valorize the land according to its legal statute. So finally, Madagascar will keep its way on, according to this, the strength of this very active multi-sectorial committee that proves the success of intersectorial dialogues. So that it is. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Valerie. I'll now invite Tim Raiden from the Trillion Trees program to speak about the collaborative approaches between various agencies and scaling up for forest restoration.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here amongst the community of experts of the GLF to talk about this stuff and examine it. Let me introduce myself. My name is Tim Raiden, and I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society, one of the partners in the Trillion Trees program, which I'm going to talk to you about briefly this evening. It's framed here as a case study on FLR. It's really a thematic program which is a collection of case studies, all of which have a lot of interesting value. I don't have the opportunity to go into all of them, so I'm going to focus just on East Africa and just on forest landscape restoration and the work of the Trillion Trees Partnership in East Africa. Trillion Trees is a collaborative initiative between three conservation NGOs, WWF, WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, my organization, and BirdLife International. Through our UK offices, the partnership has been supported by a UK-based foundation called Restore UK to start rolling, and the idea is to convene actions around this very large-scale vision of 1 trillion trees better protected and restored by 2050, which means ending deforestation, it means delivering on INDCs, it means delivering on the Bond Challenge. Essentially, if we succeed in meeting our obligations under these various commitments, then we will end up with around about 1 trillion trees better protected and restored by mid-century. That's the bold vision. The challenge is, of course, how to get there. And one of the small things we can do as a collection of NGOs is come together and try and combine our efforts. So the aim is to be catalytic by combining our individual capacities and leveraging more results that way. Together, between us, we have a field presence in over 100 countries, which is already quite significant when you start thinking about the implementation gap between the commitments under the Bond Challenge and AFR 100 and delivery on the ground. You need field-based organizations capable of delivering projects in the field, and that's one of the things that we can offer at a significantly global scale through the partnership. We've got a core team based in the UK who are mostly focused on technical support for these 100-plus landscapes. working with them to develop project ideas, and then looking for funding opportunities and financing possibilities to scale up those projects, to develop those projects, and to share lessons learned between them. We've focused initially on a pipeline of about 20 landscapes around the world, and a couple of cross-cutting policy issues on commodities and RED. The countries that we are currently working on projects in are shown in green on the map. I see you can't see much of the rest of the world, but the ones in green are the ones that matter for now. And countries with projects that we could potentially bring into the Trillion Trees pipeline shown in orange. So quite a significant global reach at the moment, and expanding, we hope, rapidly towards this very ambitious goal of the program. The program is structured around what we call different pathways to a trillion. These are essentially the strategies for delivering, which, as you see, combine a variety of themes that we know well through the GLF. Protected areas is, of course, is there for a reason. It's extremely important. I was in the session before now on landscape initiatives and the protect and produce, or produce and protect initiatives. It's important not to forget that protect is an extremely important part of delivering on deforestation commitments and meeting our climate change obligations. FLR is in there under the sustainable use of forests and sustainable timber. Zero deforestation commodity commitments as well. We have a package of work looking at commodity-related deforestation in different projects. And related to that, ethical investment, green finance that can be channeled into either forestry projects or commodity projects. And of course, RED+. Important to mention that while the temptation is to cast your eyes to the sky when people talk about RED, avoided deforestation remains the biggest and most cost-effective way of meeting natural climate solutions, the 30% of the climate mitigation potential to 2030 talked about in the recent GRISCOM paper. And we have a couple of RED+ projects that we're supporting through the Trillion Trees program. But just in East Africa then, focus on these three countries, Tanzania, which I'll talk about in a little bit of detail, also Rwanda and Uganda. In Rwanda, we're working with the Ministry of Environment on a program of work to submit to the Green Climate Fund on restoring the highlands of Rwanda and ensuring the water catchment protection role of highlands for the tea industry and the lowland agriculture in Rwanda. In Uganda, looking at the area in western Uganda, south of Murchison Falls National Park, very high deforestation rate in that part of the country, mostly for smallholder agriculture, and we're interested in promoting tree planting on smallholder farms and working with a local FSC-certified plantation company and driving that forward, talking about private sector collaborations, which is something of a theme here in this discussion. But in Tanzania specifically, this is a program of work which is really starting to come together and is a good example of how the three organizations can work productively together to deliver on a much larger scale ambition. WWF in Tanzania have been very catalytic in getting the Tanzanian government over the line with a pledge under the AFR 100, which was just formalized recently, which is fantastic news. But then beyond that, using money through the Trillion Trees Partnership, WWF will support the government in moving forward with the strategy. Going to create this FLR working group, which will take the process forward into strategy. Significant effort on fundraising to support that national level process, again with the GCF and approaches to the GEF for money to support the national program, and building the existing work that the three organizations are doing in Tanzania. So I've highlighted three landscapes where we're working. The Usambara Mountains in the north, where both BirdLife and WWF are engaged in in restoration activities and tree planting with local NGO partners. Kazimzumbwe, which is near Dar es Salaam, where WWF is working on the restoration of coastal forests and the potential involvement of ecotourism, private sector ecotourism operators in restoration agenda, and WCS in the Southern Highlands, where we are working to restore natural forest in the Rungwe Mountains and around Mbeya, and help local communities establish fuel wood lots for their own fuel wood self-sufficiency. So just on that final project, an example of the work of WCS to protect this highland forest in the Rungwe Mountains, actually forest that is critical to sustaining critically endangered primate, the kipunji, which you see at the top of the slide there, only recently discovered a new genus of monkey, which is specific. The genus name is Rungwecebus, actually specific to this small region of Tanzania, and has a population estimated to be only around 1,000 individuals. So highly endangered and unique endemic primate to this region, which was the important for WCS's mission in terms of wildlife conservation. But over the years of working there, over the last 10 years of working there, we've realized that the future of that conservation project depends on community engagement, hence the involvement with communities and responding to their needs, which include alternative sources of fuel wood to reduce pressure on the natural forest, and the restoration of catchments to prevent soil erosion and increase the stability of water provision for croplands. And so this is a project which we've been working on for around 10 years using conservation donor money, but which has enormous potential to grow around the general theme of forest landscape restoration, since the communities have responded so positively to the assistance that we've been able to provide on these two themes. It also has potential to grow into other forest reserves. There's a massive need in Tanzania to support the administration in restoration activities within those forest reserves, and work with local communities in the buffer zones to respond to their needs. So just one example of implementation on the ground, as I mentioned at the beginning, filling the implementation gap between commitment and delivery. And we hope that through this partnership of the three organizations, we can do both, engaging at national levels to create the finance, to bring the finance necessary for the national scale ambition, and continue to expand our positive track record of on-the-ground delivery in these 100+ landscapes around the world. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, and we thank all our participants, our panelists, for these very engaging discussions about long-term engagement with diverse landscapes in diverse ecosystems, and also looking at diverse entry points through communities, plantations, through financing, in terms of forest and landscape restoration in general. We are now going to open the floor for questions and comments and discussion. I would like to request that you keep your question short and succinct so that we can take as many contributions as possible, and also indicate to whom your question or comment is directed so that they can respond to it. The floor is open. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Steve Ball. I'm from FSC. Thank you all for some really good presentations and great work that's going on. I have an observation which I'll share, and then a specific question. And that is that, of course, we're really keen, and it's a continual theme of these 2 days and the previous discussions we had at the AFR 100 about attracting private finance. And I think that's really important. There's a huge gap between what public finance can deliver and the extent of our ambitions. And And yet we seem to struggle quite a lot, I think, to think where is that going to come from and how is it going to come, and there's a lot of focus on innovative financing mechanisms, and I think that's important. But I also think that maybe the best way of attracting private finance is for the people with money to see existing efforts and initiatives, involvement of the private sector to be successful in making money, because making money is a great way of attracting new money. So my question is, well, perhaps yes, and we should look at what the issues around those companies are facing. So my question is particularly to Patrick, and to ask, you did mention about procurement standards, but maybe there are one or two other things that you might just pick out as example of the sort of assistance you would like to see from either government in Uganda or elsewhere to make your business success. I'm not necessarily talking about money here, but policies and what's standing in the way of more success in new forests. Thank you.
Patrick, you could take that, then we can take more questions.
Thank you. I think there is no running away from money. It's the elephant in the room, and grappling with it I think is going to be an important part of a meaningful dialogue. So it is critical to find some innovative financing solution that allows for private sector companies to actually thrive in this space. I like what you say. If we are unsuccessful, it's going to be increasingly harder to attract anybody else behind us. And the challenge that lies ahead becomes even more difficult. So I think there is a joint benefit in cracking that one. So financing is a big deal. DFIs have done their bit. Private sector investors have tried. We have begun to see movement with private foundations moving into the space, but it's not going to solve it. It's not enough. We need to think harder. We need to come up with something new. We have some ideas which we've shared, but I think, Steve, that to me would be the most important thing to solve. Policies, I think speaking from a Ugandan perspective, we are quite fortunate to have meaningful policies. We struggle a bit with implementation. That's another story. Yeah, so for now, I would say let's crack that finance puzzle, and that will be good.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Yes.
More a comment than a question. I cannot agree more with what you just said. I think private investment and making money out of landscapes is happening, and let's say African Development Bank, AU, there's a strong movement into these engaging with the private sector and increasing the productivity of land with all kind of goals. But the angle of biodiversity conservation, wildlife conservation, sustainable management of natural resources, ecosystem services, that's often forgotten, and that's what you said. So we, as a community concerned with these issues, need to step forward and find these innovative business models that where a farmer can run a business and live, increase his livelihood, while at the same time we can achieve all the goals that we have mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I see a question over there.
I would like to start by thanking all the presenters and also thank them for the work well done in efforts of forest and landscape restoration. But for my colleagues from Uganda, you made an observation which is true, and we have done it before, where we have worked through private partners, public partnership arrangements with some of the private investors, where we did not only work on the enabling environment, but we allowed them to access some level of financial resources from a government initiative. But working with the communities is true. which you should really value if you want your businesses to thrive. From sensing the environment, if you ignore that, it might become more difficult for you. But I want to assure you that in all pipeline projects and the planning we have at the ministry, we want to go holistically, and the private sector we cannot forget, because that is our biggest drivers, the biggest engine to promote investments in the sector. The only appeal I'm making is that whatever plans you are doing, you also interest us as a government in, you share with us, involve us, because many times you sit there, do your business plans, we don't have any idea of what is happening. This is important for us to align additional support, especially for the communities around you, because this is one of our biggest responsibilities as government. We will not leave it only for you, but also try to chip in something for them, because alone you will not thrive amidst a poor community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's more of a comment. So we can take another question from the back over there.
Thank you. I'm Vito from Ethiopia. I do have one question for Rwanda, no, for Ugandans. What is the role of the government for the private sectors in relation to the market linkage?
Uganda. That was your question.
If I had right, Kendi, the question is, what is the role of government in marketing?
In market linkage for the private sectors who are involved in forestry, tree planting, especially there.
Okay, market linkage. When you look at the agroforestry space in Uganda, we typically have two major product lines. Either we are servicing the electrification program, or we are developing sawmilling products, and there's a whole variety of them. What I can point out with confidence, and I'm sure my commissioner might have other examples to give, is regional trading blocks. The East African community is a pretty good example, where we have, or should have, preference for products that are sourced locally within an individual country, within the regional bloc, and then further afield. Where we struggle as private sector actors is that doesn't always play out in practice. So I hope that addresses your question. So effective regional blocks is very much a mandate of government. We've seen it work in some instances. For example, my company exports electricity poles into Kenya, and that's a direct result of government work that allows for private sector actors to find new markets and access new markets. Where we struggle with implementation is that doesn't always work, and that's a whole other long story. But there is a very distinct role for government to play to ensure that private sector actors thrive.
Thank you. I saw a hand somewhere there. Oh yes.
Hi there, sorry, I don't think it was my hand, but Charlie Langan from Uganda Carbon Bureau, Uganda. When we talk about the private sector, we're often talking about finance and the fact we just need to get it. But actually, one of the strengths of the private sector is entrepreneurism, and actually creative entrepreneurism would be actually something we could really capture here. And I contend that there's not enough support for kind of taking a risk on creative business models to solve environmental problems. I'd be interested from the panel for their thoughts on that idea about how can we bring out creative entrepreneurism and support that into addressing these environmental problems.
Mm-hmm. I don't know who can take that. Maybe Tim?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the entrepreneurialism and the private sector and investment flows into the private sector where there's a really strong market proposition, really strong business plan based on a market, and if you're looking at it from the farmer level up, you talk about the off-taker or the where's the market opportunity, and if there's a strong business proposition there, then there's good potential that the private sector could build an investable proposition around it. But I actually want to push back slightly, or maybe just be slightly controversial about the focus on private sector as the exclusive answer to what we're really trying to achieve here in sustainable landscapes. Because I do agree that they're an essential part of the picture, but if we talk about produce and protect, the production part of the landscape is actually not where we need to be acting if we want to do something about deforestation, and where the biggest results are in terms of protecting biodiversity and protecting the climate. And it is very hard to get private sector investment and private sector entrepreneurship going in those forested parts of the landscape where there isn't a clear market link or a clear market proposition, which is partly why I mentioned RED in the presentation. One of the greatest challenges is getting. We used to talk about internalizing the externalities of environmental degradation. And the need to make markets for those externalities. And carbon is the one where we've made the most progress. Over here we talked about environmental services and watershed protection and those things which are theoretically marketable and could be suitable for investment as investment proposition for the private sector. But first of all, you have to create a market, and the experience with carbon has been a real struggle, and it remains a real struggle. So, and if you talk to, and in watershed services and in watershed protection, as an investment proposition, we're still many, many years away from that in most parts of the world. So it's not easy to get private sector investment going, and especially not where there's not a real clear product off-taker agreement with a ready market for the services or product provided.
Thank you very much. I see you, but let me ask Valerie one question. What is the government of Madagascar next steps or strategy in terms of scale and time for landscape restoration? You mentioned it a little bit in your presentation, but could you say more about it?
Thank you. So first of all, we plan a massive mobilization as a way for responding a large-scale restoration. And after that, there is also the need of clearly delimiting the status of each land in order to better determine how to use each land, like better determine the boundaries for forestry land, the boundaries for livestock lands, and the boundary for agriculture, and so on and so forth. So after this, we can identify the technical issue and the way to valorize each land. So we comes from land tenure first. And by the way, there is a project on land ownership securitization that is implemented now in Madagascar as part of implementation project for FLR. And as we are talking more about private sector involvement, It is also crucial for Madagascar as perspective to set up a financial architecture for better identifying all the funding, the source, and how to mobilize. So the mechanism of mobilization included the promotion of private investment, the promotion of payment for ecosystem service, and the promotion of also the enterprise's responsibility. And finally, we also, as now, we are setting up all the national framing with our national document, the national strategy, and the national guidelines for prior landscapes. And now we are going through operational phases, through implementation by scaling at regional and local level, by doing some capacity buildings for stakeholders at regional level, and after all, as an oil stain, doing capacity building at a local level, so at the communes and village level. So in this way, we need to declinate the national committee that it's now very active at the regional level for ensuring the implementation. So thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a question over there. Yes. Could you use the microphone, please?
I very much appreciate the presentation and the result that have been presented. But if I'm right, the project that you present and the results are funded by international NGOs like WWF and other organizations, right? So, since we are talking of scaling up, talking of linkage between from local to national, do you consider that after this success, because you present a lot of success, and you even present what should be done to ensure like full success of the project in scaling up or whatever. So do you consider that after the success that we have, it's possible to drain national funding in scaling up, for example? Did you get my question? Not relying on international NGOs for scaling up. Do you consider because Stefan Schmidt in his presentation was saying this is demonstration that it can work in Madagascar, in Ethiopia, but after demonstrating that it will work, is it the responsibility of international NGOs, development partners, to support for scaling up, or should we consider that scaling up should come mainly from national funding and national efforts? I don't know if you get my question.
I get the question, and I think the panelists understand the question. Can I request, Simon, that you take that question, because you've worked in a landscape with WWF for a long time.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and I think you are right. The project that we implemented in the landscape was one of the first projects on FLR in Madagascar. So at that time, there was no strategy, no national strategy actually on FLR. But at WWF, we had a program called Forest for Life at that time, and they initiated the FLR activities within WWF first. So yes, you are right. But when you say upscaling, from my point of view, there are two aspects, I think. The first one is the framework. And I think As I said, Madagascar has no strategy, as mentioned by my colleague from the ministry. That is one of the important steps that we needed to have. And I think someone has said that all policies are good, but the challenge is not the implementation. And I think that is correct. The framework is really important, the national strategy, and the priority settings. For example, I've been talking about the priorities in terms of geography. Where are the landscape to be restored? This exercise was done after the development of a strategy, of course. And the second aspect is about finance and investment. We have been talking a lot about private sector investment, and yes, I agree that we need to mobilize private sector, but also we need to mobilize some large funding from I'm talking about, for instance, about GCF, UGF. These are the funding that we need to implement the strategy and the action plan and on FLR. That's it.
I don't see another hand, so let me ask Stefan a question. In your view, what has to happen to achieve the 100 million hectares of forests, landscapes by 2030 in an ideal situation? What needs to happen? Stefan.
In an ideal world?
Yes.
I have the chance to breathe for 40
Yeah.
It requires a strong multi-stakeholder approach, definitely. A strong leadership of government. Government is responsibility. You need political will and you need political commitment. Without it, you will not succeed. That is key. The government needs to set the rule of the game. So that's a starting point. And then you need, in particular, at local level, communities, you need civil society, you need local communities that are involved, that are convinced that it is in their own interest to conserve their resources. And I fully agree, we cannot leave it entirely to the private sector, definitely not. But the private sector has to play a role, a catalytic role in implementing, bring investment in and so on both sides. On the side of the agriculture to make that more productive, and on the side of the forestry and restoration. And, well, that depends on the role of government again. We know that these resources do have a value. They have a value, but today they do not have a price tag. And it is that we need a transformation in that this value needs to be transformed into a real price tag, that there needs to be a benefit and an economic benefit for those who are restoring and protecting landscapes, and those who need to pay for using the resources. That is. And so that is my overall picture in 2 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And we are out of time. Was there a hand at the back? No. We're out of time for the question and answer session. I will now move to the wrap-up session, and I would like to invite Nancy Githaiga, who will give us a summary and reflections of FLR case studies that we've just heard about here. Nancy Githaiga, please.
Thank you very much, Kendi, and thank you, the panelists, and of course, the participants. I have 5 minutes to summarize what we have discussed in the last 1 hour, and they had less than 15 minutes to summarize what they have done the last 15 years. So probably mine is a little easier. I think what makes this gathering very, very important is that we can talk about moving from commitment to action, because that's usually where we have a gap. Commitment is easy. Africa has committed 100 million hectares, but commitment is easy. Kenya, which is my country, I think we have committed 5.1 million hectares by 2030. Very ambitious, but great targets. So we have had the experiences from, I think, 3 countries or more than that. More about, we say it is important actually to dine and wine at UN like we are doing, or at the Hilton, but it is also important for us to dirty our hands in the Serengeti, in Usambara, and what we are actually doing in Uganda. So the experiences that we are sharing is more how we are dirtying our hands on this. So we have discussed briefly on the business perspective, plantations. As a business, plantations making economic sense, the issue of innovative financing and blended finance, as we have heard from Uganda, and the need for that. And I think we cannot underscore the importance of the valuation, because sometimes when we bring in private sector, we are basically looking at, if I plant trees and sell them after 15 years, what are the returns? But I think listening to the participants, I mean, it's more value than that. It's the ecosystem services that we don't value, and maybe we haven't gotten a buyer yet for that, and therefore even the private sector, when they are looking at this, it's more, what do I get in 10 years, in 15, and in 20 years? We've also heard from Madagascar on the role of communities being at the center of this work on restoration, and also importantly, the commitment of Madagascar government and even issues of land use plans and how this would fit into these great ambitions. We've also listened from Tim and the role of partnerships, I think bringing together different organizations, WCS, BirdLife, WWF, and others, of course, in the Trillion Tree campaign. But the fact that this is bringing together partners, these are just 3 or 4, but the importance of partnerships can actually not be underscored if we are actually going to make inroads by 2030. For WWF, of course, this is important because the threats that are posed by deforestation, as was mentioned by Mr. Schmidt, are actually huge and even more worse for Africa and other developing nations. And in last year, 2017, we actually joined the African Forest Landscape Challenge, again, which is just a mechanism to implement or to action the Bond Challenge. And the fact that we need to maximize collaboration and knowledge sharing, like what we are doing today, is very, very important. And this challenge, as we've said, is big, and it is ambitious, and it is good, but it certainly requires the different strategies that we are talking about. We've talked about private sector, their role, the communities, and their role. The government, which should drive this, to moving from just commitment to willing and actually investing in it, because it should actually be the lead in doing this. And I think we have been reminded by the lady from Uganda, and we've also been, that has been mentioned also from Madagascar. The need to translate our ideas into bankable and scalable projects, I think, is an issue that was raised, and it is important because we must change strategy if we are going to attain what we are looking at. But the conclusion that has been made, that we need partnerships, strong partnerships. We need the different sectors. We need communities who probably are the major stakeholders. We need the private sector who probably are the major stockholders. And we also need some stakeholders. I think someone was talking about the stick and the carrot. So we probably need also stakeholders in this if we are going to attain what we are looking at. So that partnership is pivotal. Of course, we are not preaching, we are converted. I think all of us know that we actually need to get to that ambition. But the how we are going to get there, so that in 2025 we are not pushing this commitment to 2050 and pushing it to 2070, is what is actually very, very important for us. And I think it was important to have this meeting today. So as we continue to think about innovative financing, which is key, about government taking leadership, because there is already commitment, I think the role of every one of us is actually major and pivotal for the success of this work. So that is how I would summarize our discussions today, and to thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for that summary. I don't think there is anything to add because she's captured the discussions that we've had very well. I now invite you to join me in thanking all the panelists that have spoken to us today. And the final thing that I would say is that may we all continue working towards rechiseling the three-legged African stool, which I now no longer see. I last saw it over there. So if it's somewhere there, you could bring it forward. Thank you very much. And thank you for your participation as well.